So we're here today with two members of an interesting organization that I frankly had not heard of until one of them told me about it. Kathy Miles and Dan Nolet are from Boyle County, and they're here to talk to us about something called Resilient Boyle, which resilient is one of my favorite words anyway. So Dan and Kathy, welcome to the state of Kentucky.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce.
So, Kathy, why don't you tell us briefly what Resilient Boyle is all about?
Sure. A community organization born originally out of the Garden Club of Danville, the Conservation Committee, which was looking for ways to address advocacy and education around climate change. So we began in November 2022, just starting to, from a local perspective. So starting to look at what was currently being done, what did people understand locally about how we were locally being affected already by climate change, and then what still needed to be done on an ongoing basis, obviously, as things heated up, so to speak.
I think it's fascinating that it came out of the Garden Club. These are often people who are very much in touch with what's happening weather-wise, climate-wise, because obviously it affects their gardening efforts. So I think that's really interesting. How many every organization has members, but how many active members would you say you have?
So we have about 9 or 10 active members. This is a loosely constructed organization. We don't at this point have bylaws. We are not a 501c3. Everyone in the group pretty much represents other groups who have an interest in this topic. So we're kind of representing a lot of groups in the community, even though we're a fairly small group.
The point, Bruce, is we kind of link across multiple organizations. So like the Garden Club is one, but representation there includes county government, Chamber of Commerce, Planning and Zoning, Board of Adjustments. They're all kind of part of that crew.
Wow. So you've got actually governmental agencies and the chamber and so on and so forth involved. That's great. Do they have problems with the idea of facing the climate crisis, or are they really on board?
I would have to say the people who attend our meetings know that there are people who might have problems with understanding and addressing it, but the people who attend are on board to know that we need to be doing more, and we need our community to see this as our local issue that we should continue to address.
So Dan, how did you get involved?
Well, I got involved through basically planning and zoning. I'm on the planning commission in the city as a city of Danville rep. But I got invited by one of the members to participate in a project called Solarize Boyle, which is trying to advocate for more rooftop solar homeowners and small solar installations. Thinking about how do we make our community more energy resilient in that sense. And so there was already a link with Preston Miles, who's a retired center professor, Kathy's husband, and he's tied into the Kentucky Solar Energy Society that is sponsoring these things. They did Louisville and Lexington and Frankfurt in the past. So he asked me, would I be willing to join him in this effort? Preston and I are the local lead guys for Solarize Boyle. And it's our first year, 2024.
Okay.
Boyle and the surrounding 6 counties.
Okay. So, Kathy, there's education and there's mitigation and there's advocacy. Which of those do you think your group mainly works on, or all three?
We have been educating ourselves. So we started knowing that we are forging a path that has not been forged before in our community, and not many communities, as far as we can tell, across the country. To have a group, particularly inland, there are groups across the country along the coasts, but to have a group in a place like Danville, Kentucky, that really wants to stay on a long-term problem like this, but really we don't have many models. So we've been educating ourselves pretty much until early this year. So we've done things like tour the local water plant to ask about water situations in emergencies, to look at capacity. We've invited the hospital, which happens to be involved in a strategic planning process right now. So we've talked with the hospital about how do you look at healthcare issues in the future. Disaster management. We've educated ourselves, begun to do that on whether we're really ready. Our county's ready for some of the disasters like flooding and significant storms, as well as power outages. What are we ready for? And we learned from that one. We had a quick initiative that came out of that. We learned that a lot of people just don't have lists, there wasn't a central list available to them of what were their emergency numbers that they needed to be able to call. So we actually, our extension office, who's a part of, they're a part of this group as well. That's where we meet, and we have two of their staff members who are part of us. And they were able to develop some refrigerator that we've been sharing with the community about what are those emergency numbers. Education has been what we've tried to do for ourselves, as well as educating ourselves on what works with educating the public, particularly when they're resistant people. But I'd have to say, given that we're in the process of a comprehensive plan for land use in this community, advocacy is a big part of what we are trying to do, as well as education, as well as mitigation.
So, Dan, what are the climate crisis problems that you think are particularly facing Danville?
Well, I think we highlighted a couple things as we started to dig into the information. One, Chamber of Commerce kind of had highlighted for us the housing shortage, particularly workforce housing. Our community is growing, has added jobs, but not added as much housing as we've added jobs. And so we have a net influx of people driving from outlying counties into Boyle. And, if you think about the potential for in-migration, particularly in our areas from coastal areas, that's something we've been pulling out or researching. We're trying to think, well, what would happen if we grew by 1,000 households or 5,000 people? What would it look like? What would it feel like? And as Kathy said, that kind of fits into where we're thinking with the comprehensive plan updates that we're in the middle of right now.
Does Danville have much risk from flooding?
We do in certain parts of the county. Have had some significant flooding in western Boyle County, in the Knob region. So it differs for different parts of the county, even though we're a relatively small county.
I have tried in the past, even just recently, to talk about agriculture and rain. And what does it look like if you get less rain, but in a summer, but more of it at one time? So instead of having a shower of half an inch once a week, you go 3 weeks with no rain and then have 3 inches in one day. So for agriculture, that has obvious implications. Does that affect the town, is your water, and you mentioned the water system, is the water and sewer system capable of dealing with that kind of runoff?
No, I was going to say that was one of our questions, and Dan can tell you when we visited the water plant, but it continues to be a reason we needed extension involved in this very much is because of we have one of the people our farm agent, and he is the one who works with farmers on these very issues. So it's really important that they be represented in this group.
And I think there's a difference perhaps between the city and the adjacent areas and their ability to deal with flooding versus the outlying areas and the more rural parts of Boyle County, where I think that's really becomes an issue. You have roads that flood or farms that, as you mentioned, are going to have to deal with less frequent rain, maybe the same volume, but
Right.
the frequency is going to be different.
I'm impressed, really, that you have government officials and the chamber and so on and so forth involved. What about your surrounding counties? Does their leadership have any interest, or do they tend to just poo-poo the whole problem?
That's a great question, because the whole issue of regionalization is really coming up with our economic development corporation in Danville. We have not dealt with that directly. I don't know, Dan, I don't know if you know. I don't know if we've not heard that our local surrounding counties have a similar organization. I don't think that they do.
Yeah,
But
we've
regional issues are more.
right. I think we feel like it would be useful to do more regional, but at the same time, I think the sense is the other counties are not as open to that discussion, particularly when you think about, the words climate change trigger for some people. So we have to figure out how do we talk about climate in terms of extreme weather, and how do we talk about it in a way that is not so threatening to some people, or doesn't get into the politicization of things that we've seen in across the country.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that issue to some extent. I also, being the advocate that I am, I also want to say, well, guess what? The weather doesn't care about your politics, and it's going to rain on the red and the blue, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but I think there's a way to be maybe more effective in our communications, just by perhaps changing some of the words that we use and emphasizing, as Kathy said in the beginning of our discussion, emphasizing the local impact and local issues. Yeah, there's a national issue. Yeah, we have to do a worldwide action about this, but we can build up from local.
So I really like the use of the term extreme weather, because I think most people, if you say that, they'll go, well, yeah, we're seeing extreme weather. We're past the point, for the most part, of prevention, and we're into the point of preparation and mitigation. Do you see that people are open to talking about how do we prepare for the future, and even more, how do we prepare for the future of our children?
I think lots of people are open. I think we've found that, Dan, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, very much so.
And I also think one of the things I think we're doing at this early stage still of this group is just to ask questions, just to go to meetings like to talk to healthcare folks, to go to our comprehensive plan community meetings and just ask the question. So are we thinking ahead as we do a plan about what could happen as a result of these changes? Because some people just don't think about how there's so many areas of your life that are being affected by this. So asking questions is is probably more powerful than I think any of us realized until we kind of got into this. What would you say about that, Dan?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think, as I look at where we're going in the update to the comprehensive plan, we've been able to elevate that goal of being resilient, and building in community resilience as one of the key goals and objectives in the comprehensive plan. So, talking about it and kind of educating ourselves and educating others, that that's getting into the planning function. So we'll see how we include that in the objectives that come as the next step following the goal.
Excellent. Resilience is one of my favorite topics, one of my favorite words. When I was teaching in a corporation, we talked about having resilient organizations, resilient teams, even resilient software, meaning that it's able to survive and even thrive in the midst of change. So trying to have a resilient community means change is coming and we have to be ready to deal with it. In terms of questions, I wrote an article years ago about, is Louisville ready for climate change? And I'll put a link to that below this video on YouTube and on our site. And perhaps that will be information you can use when you go to these meetings. I'm very excited about your organization. I love local organizing. I love seeing people step up and say, this is something we need to deal with. We can't just sit back. Everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. And you're doing something, and I applaud you. Keep me informed of how things are going, because I probably will want to talk to you again in the fall and see how the group is going and what other actions you've taken.
We would. We got some things we're talking about that we could probably share by then. So, and thank you for sending that link.
Kathy Miles and Dan Nolet, thank you both for being on the State of Kentucky, and thank you for forming and guiding and growing Resilient Boyle. I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce.